Hey, good morning. Well, it's been a very interesting time, a challenging time, a dangerous time. Minnesota, world wars, civil wars, a lot of breeding at the edges of catastrophe, chaos, collapse. These are all kinds of words you'll hear. So all of that can get not only depressing, at some level of what's happening in terms of we seem to be unable to get along together. I bring to you today a short talk on some real techniques, I suppose, that I found really useful for intervening in the fear, terrorization, violence of all kinds, from the very subtle epistemic, knowledge-based ways of terrifying people out of what they know because somebody else knows better and is going to tell them the way to know, and out of the violence of just physical, of course, and emotional abuse, oppression, all without going into this. Let's go right to the interventions that I want to bring. Thanks for listening today. Look forward to you practicing some of these, passing these on through this video and otherwise to share about what you found effective as well in dealing with this terrorization, this fearism toxicity form that becomes terrorism at a civil level and not just at a political level, right? Like at a really deep, cutting, human, dehumanizing level. We've seen the news, we've seen enough of the stories. I try to really limit my diet on all of that news media, especially on social media. But this is a challenge we all have is how much media do you want? How much media is healthy for you and how much is not? Won't go into that, but as I say, reduce your amount of exposure. That will help your system. And I'm talking about your body, mind, soul, spirit, and your way of being in the world in equanimity to some degree, right? Not in the world in kind of an anxious panic emergency mode. Your system, biologically, ecologically, evolutionary, is not made to be in emergency mode for very long. That's why fear is great as a natural instinct when it's in its healthy form, but when it becomes a constant chronic form of emergency, it's like listening to the fire alarm going in your house or apartment, right? Your smoke detector or whatever, and it doesn't stop ringing, even though you've calmed the smoke down, or actually it wasn't that dangerous, it was just a toaster. And the alarm keeps going, see, and then it echoes, and then you're not sleeping at night because the alarm's still going. And that's the neurocircuitry of your brain to be rewired from this very human higher, capacity brain to an emotional kind of heart brain. Some people talk about in the mammalian complex. And then the reptilian part of us is on this reactive, reflexive, alert, fight, flight, very extreme behaviors. And basically, I don't feel secure, is what that nervous system is telling you. You better do something. But the problem is there's so many news items that you can look at every day are disturbing things, disturbing events that are threatening to you in some way, even though they're at a distance. You are a witness to them. So trauma research shows that just witnessing a trauma, witnessing an abuse of another being, just talk about human beings today, but it can be other kinds of beings that are on this planet that we share with. It disturbs your nervous system. So we have got a lot of self-care, right, to look at, but it's a lot of just soul care as well. So you can use whatever those terms you connect with. Here are the couple examples I want to give of things that I have picked up of what is a really useful technique. And part of it's going to focus around sound and drumming and shakers, noisemakers. That could be like jingle bell shakers as well. So I, in this house, have made sure we have drums to drum in that kind of a drum, an indigenous type drum or a Celtic drum, And then shakers, these jingle shakers that are fun. You can get them at a music store or even probably at the dollar store. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but the nicer sounding ones you can get at a music store for fairly inexpensive. Just fit in your hand. Tambourine would be another. So if you have any of those kinds of noisemakers, and again, they could be quite simple, could be childlike toy noisemakers, but those won't sound as nice. And not nice is actually a problem, is because they're not going to have the depth and quality of a resonant, really nice instrument, like a tambourine, like a shaker. And so, of course, then there's all the various shakers, right, that are used, the maracas and so on. So get some of those. That's my advice for this video. And here's why. They will act as a fear vaccine. In my terminology, they will act to retransmit and reform and reshape. You've got neuroplasticity to get out of sounds and inputs from video screens, from television, from videos, movies, whatever you're watching that is going to have a emotional, violent, and terrorizing messaging with it. It upsets us. And all social media is meant to upset you because more people pay attention to it, because your fear trigger is on and you think you should, because there's an emergency going on and you want to be safe and secure safety for your others. So we are addicted to, unfortunately, we're easily primed to pay attention to that because we don't want to die. We don't want to be hurt. So we have a fear that's very deep that can be preyed upon, and it is preyed upon systematically through behavioral manipulation, propaganda, intimidation, bullying. You can use all those words that you wish. I just call it the fear project. It's a fear projection onto all of us that dehumanizes us as humans. Very damaging over a lifetime, and very damaging when you're really young and you're still trying to figure out how to process it. So back to all the noisemakers, the sound makers, and movement. So these are three examples that will show you how to demonstrate, in my experience, what actually works quite nicely. If you want to do more neurological, bioneurological research on how to get this rewiring out of trauma, that's up to you. There's tons of work out there on, vagal, polyvagal theory, and so on. EMT, emotional management theory, hypnosis, etc. It's all part of a type of hypnotic trance that I'm going to be talking about today through these musical instruments and through movement. Very simple. Don't have to have a therapist, quote, right? You don't have to pay anybody. You can do this yourself. So it's just like good, healthy management in these very terrifying times. Of course, you can go for a walk in nature too, and that often helps. All right. First example is I go back 7 years ago. I made a video called When Fear Meets Fearlessness. I was just watching it and getting the memory back that there was this indigenous kind of a protest of indigenous First Nations peoples in the United States at one in Washington, protesting against, the government for various reasons of injustices. And at one point, it was a fairly small rally, but there was a lot of Indigenous people, and then all the friends of Indigenous people there, and there was a lot of people drumming. And then I remember the news picked up on a story where a group of Catholic high school boys, very hyper and very vigilant activists, I don't know who their teachers or whoever brought those kids here to this site, were anti-Indigenous people and anti this protest, and they interrupted it through various teenage type of ways boys can get, especially when they gang up together and get all hyper adrenalized. And there was a huge encounter between one particular, teenager and this Nathan Phillips, who was one of the indigenous, not leaders of that movement, but he was in that movement protesting with his drum. And this teenager did everything he could to threaten, to yell at, to scream at, to disenfranchise, and try to tell these indigenous people, go away, you have nothing to say to us. This is a white America. We're the first founders of the country. We are who you rely and on with all these insults. And I remember the indigenous leader just keeping one look, and they were looking eye to eye, and the indigenous leader just kept the drum going. Didn't say a word. And all this barrage of hate. And of course, it's fear underneath that hate of that young teenager. But he had been pumped up to such a degree to attack, right? So you're either flight or fight. Well, the indigenous leader was not fighting and not flighting, not freezing, not fawning, right? Where you try to appease the oppressor or a bullier and maybe try to get on their side so they won't hurt you. None of that. What this indigenous leader did was this other technique of a response to fear and terror. And I went, oh, that's fearlessness. That's the fear vaccine in process. Fascinating. And it's an artistic, aesthetic way. That's what I'm teaching you today. I'm going to give a couple other stories. And he just kept it going. Didn't get louder, didn't get less, quieter under the barrage. Just held. And these two were like 2 feet apart and spitting anger and hatred at this indigenous elder, Nathan Phillips. Okay. Well, what's going on is a lot of different things. And what it is basically going on is keep your focus on movement and sound that you find resonant. What do I mean by that? It means it harmonizes you. So that drum, boom, 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 boom. And that's a hypnotic entrance prompting. In other words, we're very susceptible to repetition like that. You also know that that's part of the heartbeat, and it's found across the world in many traditions, cultures. It doesn't matter through history that when we have evidence of early musical caliber, activities anthropologically, this kind of drumbeat or bum 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 bum, whatever it might be, along that idea, it's found everywhere. It's universal. And you kind of go, well, yeah, why are we drumming? We don't have to live. We drum because it regulates and self-regulates, puts us in a trance space where we can take all the pressures and fears of the day, whether it's from fear of starvation, fear of, I just lost my child, I lost my husband, I just, getting sick, or my grandparent just died. Living is scary. It's fearful. It couldn't be terrifying. And then you could also be in war, where another tribe or group or even an individual wants to destroy you. It could be about around abuse. Somebody in your village, in your town, wants to destroy you and take you out, is following you. Predatory. It's tough. It's tough, right? So we have this deep susceptibility to this deep fear and terrorization, and that can be used against you politically. And that's what was going on in this indigenous interaction with the white teenager. 2 males. We know this is a very tense. They could have gotten into a physical fight any second. But the indigenous elder knew how to keep it together. And no attack. The white guy, young guy, looked brave. Oh, yeah. Looked very brave in front of all his peers because they're watching him and they're taking photographs. I mean, teenagers will do incredibly brave things, but one would question, well, what's underneath the bravery? And I would say definitely they're terrified. They're terrified of indigenous people taking back their land that they originally owned and claiming that they have rights. And white supremacist type thinking does not want to give rights to anybody except white people. The European, that came over here and basically stole the land and tried to eliminate through genocides of all kinds, still going on today. The next story is I was watching a documentary and it was in the Amazonian forests. Again, very ancient tribe of indigenous peoples. Um, they were protesting against the primarily European white capitalist world of invaders who'd come into the Amazon forest and were taking their forest down, right, for planting rubber trees and other kinds of oil trees to collect oils for grand markets around the world. And we're giving the indigenous people virtually no rights and protections or profits from what they were stealing, basically, more or less. Corporations, backed by the military, backed by the government, against these indigenous people who were protesting and saying no. So they were in a group protesting on this dirt road area in the forest. And I noticed huge amounts of people shooting guns over their heads because they're just with their spears and, very bows and simple things. They're not shooting at anybody. They have them if they need to protect themselves, and their children were there, and their women were there. It was like the whole community shows up at the protest, but the government is sending in military jets that are flying over. People are shooting over their heads with guns. Sound cannons even can be used against protesters. Okay, so what were the indigenous? Well, the camera zoomed in on particularly a grandmother with a 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and was holding the 2-year-old's hand as the 2-year-old standing there, and the camera zooms in, and this 2-year-old's just like totally distressed, right, crying, 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 just deep distress of this all these huge loud noises, right, and of course that little child can feel the tension of all of people's emotions around them, and the other police or the white folks that were with the corporations, whoever it was, hassling them. And the indigenous people say, well, you're not going to push us around in some way or another, right? So the child's caught in this huge conflict, and it's really, you can only imagine how terrorizing it is because you can't explain everything to a 2-year-old. So they're just going through this incredible body release discharging through it all. And the grandmother is holding battle, going like this, right over the ear. So the child isn't even looking at the rattle, they're just looking at the scene of whatever the violence was going on in this protest, or really being careful, right, to make sure that they could figure out what's going on. Yeah, you pay attention, super attention. But when you're paying super attention in that high concentration, even though you're emotionally discharging, you're very highly susceptible to being hypnotically inducted by messages. You're stupid. You're no good. You people should get out of here. You're animals. Whatever the messages are, you're highly susceptible, and that will go deep into your nervous system when you're in that trance fear state. High concentration plus fear, very easy to hypnotize. But the grandmother, like intuitively, right, over generations and generations, they've known we will control the hypnosis of our own children and not let the propaganda, the oppressors, control that hypnosis and give messages to us that internalize and oppress us and make us feel dehumanized, less than, worthless, hopeless. No. There she was. And then she'd switch to the other ear. And the camera's on this. Child's still crying, discharging. Jets are going over, literally over their heads to scare them. Military. Guns going off. And there's the rattle. Why? Because the child knows grandma has got the rattle. And the rattle is magical. It's got power. And it's got power to help keep our brain from wiring up the way somebody else wants to terrorize us and wire our brain up in that traumatic brain wiring, which will totally start to rip you down emotionally, psychologically, soulfully, spiritually. That's how you diminish people. That's called torture, systematic torture. And you can use sounds to torture another person. You can use images, of course, too. There's the mother singing and chanting. And I noticed she was also humming and chanting while she was rattling in the ear. Third story, recently, Barbara and I are listening to, my partner, listening to the Minnesota news and various other bits, which we watch every once in a while just to stay in touch with. And, you know, it was just at night and the end of a good day. We're not like distressed, but we noticed that we're just kind of freezing up. So we just shared, some of the things going on that we've heard on media, and we don't watch a lot. And we're sort of sitting there in the silence going, I don't feel good. Like, how do you feel? And she's feeling a bit numb. This is like, early in the evening, and we're going, are we going to spend the next, 3 hours before we go to bed in this state of kind of bit frozen? Like, because you kind of just don't know what to do after a while when you get that input on all the most distressing things going on with the shootings, for example, in Minnesota, just how it resonates a fear-based terrorization throughout the population. And I know not everybody feels the same experience, but watching that, some are very happy about it, so-called. And then most humans who still feel something empathetically for another human being can feel the great injustice. Of course, we just finished and are still watching and what's going on in Gaza and the genocide there. Without all the politics of it, this is about this deeply decapacitating that goes with listening and hearing, watching those imageries of massive, dehumanization. Barbara walks over and I did intuitively and picks up the big drum we have, huge big drum we were given from an indigenous maker of drums through another person to another person, then it was given to us. And she just starts banging, big slow bang, and this drum just resonates and fills the whole room. It's like huge vibration, right? So it wasn't like a steady beat or anything. It was just like a boom, boom. Did that about 10 or 15 times. Nothing being said, sung, no chanting. And then she stopped, and I knew immediately. I could feel immediately, pretty attuned to my sense of regulation, dysregulation processes in my body, what it does to my mind, how it clouds my energies, locks them up. And that was all like releasing. And then I felt like I got my brain full circuitry back, other than in this emergency reptilian type rigid brain of protection, and this numbing feeling and the opening up of consciousness, and basically a celebration of life again in the moment, what I'm experiencing, and that we are here safe in this moment in this way. And we want to be together and enjoy our evening as much as possible, not ignoring what we know about the disasters going on, right? But There's no use sitting in that paralyzed and numbed, and you will start to break down your own immune system in that because you're in a cortisone producing distress hormone, kind of situation, which you don't want to be in for very long. So we were getting a treatment, that big sound. And I have also done that many times when I was in really deep distress about a year and a half ago for various reasons. A lot of emotional distress in relationships, intimate relationships. And I used shakers often, these bells, switch it and use it in the right, just go like that. And then sometimes I'd get up and move and dance around and chant and do that for even a couple minutes. And whoa, just takes me into a much clearer space of equanimity, right? With a kind of balanced, more harmonious state, and where you can actually think better to solve problems, whether it's the big global problems or smaller problems. What can I actually do that's valuable? So these are all fear vaccines, is my argument. There's many others I could give. A lot of people use breathing techniques and yoga, meditation, mindfulness training, which is another concentration. Concentrate, more on the present awareness rather than past worse circumstances. And what does this mean about the future? You really stay in the present. I'm just giving you techniques that I've seen come out of the indigenous traditions and how long and ancient, wise people they are often, especially the ones that know the old ways. Thanks for listening to this today. Some of those ideas might be useful for you in our difficult times ahead. Let's keep in touch if you want to know more, want to talk more about what's going on, if you want to share information about what you know about the research you're doing. Maybe it's got to do with the neurobiology of fear and fearlessness, etc. Let's talk more and share. Okay, bye-bye.